The silence was deafening. An American lieutenant colonel stood inches from a Royal Guard's face. His voice cut through the crowd like a knife. "This is a direct order. Salute me, now." The guard didn't move, not even a blink. What happened next didn't just shock the crowd. It exposed a truth about military power that most people never understand. The officer thought his rank gave him authority. He was wrong. Dead wrong. And what this Royal Guard did in response? It became a lesson in military protocol that spread through NATO command in less than 24 hours. Before we reveal what happened, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Trust me, you need to see how this ends. Let's go back to where it all started. It was supposed to be a routine visit. The black motorcade rolled through the embassy gates on a gray Tuesday morning. Diplomatic flags waved in the wind. Everything looked official. Everything looked calm. Inside those vehicles sat America's top military brass. They were here for the annual NATO Strategic Leadership Summit. Standard procedure. Standard protocol. Or so they thought. Lieutenant Colonel Jackson Hayes stepped out first. His uniform was immaculate. Every medal perfectly placed, every ribbon told a story of combat. 22 years of service, 3 combat deployments, Baghdad, Fallujah, Helmand Province. This was a man who commanded respect, a man who knew military discipline inside and out. But as he looked around the embassy grounds, something caught his eye, something that made him pause. The Royal Guards, standing there in their bright red tunics and tall bearskin hats, perfectly still, like statues. The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of the building, making the whole scene look almost theatrical. It was the kind of setting that appeared on postcards and travel brochures, the image of British tradition frozen in time. But for someone like Hayes, who measured everything through the lens of combat efficiency, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like a waste of trained military personnel standing around for the entertainment of tourists with cameras. He had spent his entire career in environments where every second counted, where hesitation meant death, and where soldiers moved with purpose and urgency. This static display of ceremonial precision struck him as the opposite of everything he valued in military service. Hayes turned to Major Davis beside him. His voice dripped with skepticism. All this ceremony for what? A meeting? We could have done this at the Pentagon and saved everyone the show. Davis nodded politely, but his attention had already shifted to one guard in particular. Sergeant William Barrett stood at his post near the main entrance. His scarlet uniform blazed against the gray stone walls. His expression was blank. His eyes stared forward into nothing, the 1,000-yard stare, perfected through years of training. Hayes watched him for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "Look at that," he muttered. "Standing there like a toy soldier. What a waste." A palace coordinator approached quickly. His smile was diplomatic but firm. "Lieutenant Colonel, if you'd kindly rejoin your group. We're on a tight schedule." Hayes waved him off, but his eyes never left the guard. As the delegation walked through the grounds, Hayes couldn't stop looking back. The guards were everywhere, posted at doorways, standing near gates, all of them frozen in place. "Tell me something," Hayes said suddenly. "These guards, they're just for show, right? For the tourists?" Before anyone could answer, he continued. "Back home, we put our soldiers to actual use. This is like having mannequins in uniform." Colonel Wilson frowned. He was the senior American officer on this trip, and he could already sense where this was heading. "Jackson, the Royal Guards are operational soldiers. They rotate between ceremonial duties and combat deployments." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Seems inefficient. Having trained soldiers standing around like decorations. We optimize for utility, not pageantry." A British officer in the group spoke up. Captain Holly. He'd served alongside the Queen's Guard in Afghanistan. "I've worked with these men, Colonel. Some of the finest soldiers I've ever encountered." Hayes gave him a skeptical look. "No disrespect, Captain, but there's a difference between looking impressive and being combat ready. Modern warfare demands flexibility, not standing still for hours." The group moved on, but Hayes lingered behind. His eyes locked onto Sergeant Barrett once more, and that's when everything started to unravel. Hayes broke away from the group. Nobody noticed at first. The delegation was focused on the tour, admiring the architecture, taking photos. But Hayes had a different agenda. He walked straight toward Barrett's post. His stride was purposeful, confident. He stopped directly in front of the guard, close enough to see the buttons on his tunic. "Impressive discipline," Hayes said. His tone suggested he meant the opposite. "Though I wonder what tactical advantage comes from standing motionless while a potential threat evaluates your position." Barrett didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed forward, his expression unchanged. Hayes began to circle him, slowly, like a drill instructor inspecting a new recruit. "In the Marines, we train our soldiers to respond to threats, not ignore them. This ceremonial rigidity might look good on postcards, but military effectiveness? That's measured by adaptability." A few tourists had stopped to watch. They sensed something unusual was happening. Most visitors kept their distance from the guards. Everyone knew the unspoken rule. Look, but don't touch. Observe, but don't interfere. But Hayes moved closer. "This is the difference between our forces," he continued. "American soldiers train for real combat, real situations, not theatrical performances." Major Davis finally noticed Hayes was missing. He jogged over quickly. "Lieutenant Colonel, the delegation is moving on." Hayes waved him off without looking back. "Just having a professional exchange with our British counterpart here." The way he said professional made it sound like an insult. Davis managed to pull him away. But Hayes paused before leaving. He looked directly into Barrett's eyes. "We'll continue this discussion later, Sergeant. I'm curious to see how ceremonial training translates to real military engagement." What Hayes didn't know was the truth. The truth about who Sergeant William Barrett really was. Barrett wasn't some rookie playing dress-up. He wasn't a tourist attraction with a rifle. Just 3 months earlier, Barrett had completed his 4th combat deployment. Afghanistan, a classified joint operation. His unit had extracted high-value intelligence assets under heavy fire. Bullets flying from 3 directions. Enemy fighters closing in. Barrett had maintained absolute composure, coordinated his team with precision, completed the mission without a single casualty. That operation earned him the Military Cross for Valor, one of Britain's highest military honors. His personnel file contained commendations from American Special Forces commanders. They described him as unflappable under extreme pressure and exhibiting extraordinary discipline in chaotic conditions. The same mental control that kept him alive in combat? That's what kept him perfectly still now. The file sat in a secure office somewhere in the Ministry of Defense, filled with details that would never be made public. Mission reports described how Barrett had held his position for 6 hours straight, while enemy snipers searched for his location. How he'd talked a panicked interpreter through a minefield over a crackling radio. How he'd carried a wounded American soldier 3 kilometers through hostile territory without stopping once. These weren't the actions of someone playing soldier for the cameras. These were the decisions of a warrior who understood that survival often depended on the same quality he demonstrated now: the ability to remain absolutely calm when everything around you screamed for panic. The bearskin hat on his head and the scarlet tunic on his back didn't diminish those achievements. They represented them. Royal Guards aren't chosen randomly. They're selected specifically for their discipline, their judgment, their ability to handle pressure. Barrett had been picked for today's duty for exactly that reason. The training of a Royal Guard isn't ceremonial fluff. It's elite infantry training, 30 weeks of it, 2 weeks longer than regular British infantry. They learn urban combat, tactical movement, advanced weapon systems, the same skills as any frontline soldier. But they also learn something else, something unique. They learn absolute mental discipline, the ability to stand perfectly still for hours while tourists mock you, while people wave hands in your face, while cameras flash and children laugh. That takes a different kind of strength. And that strength? It translates directly to battlefield composure. When bullets start flying, when chaos erupts, When everything goes wrong, the soldier who can maintain absolute focus survives. The Royal Guards rotate constantly, 3 months on ceremonial duty, 6 months deployed to conflict zones, then back again. Many of the guards standing at their post that day had been in Afghanistan just 8 weeks earlier. They weren't toy soldiers. They were combat veterans. But Hayes didn't know any of this. He saw the bright red uniform, the tall hat, the stillness, and he made an assumption, the worst assumption he could make. Hayes couldn't let it go. The delegation had moved on to view the staterooms, official paintings, historic artifacts, the usual diplomatic tour, but halfway through, Hayes slipped away again, this time with purpose. He walked back across the grounds, faster now, more determined. A larger crowd had gathered near Barrett's post, morning tour groups with cameras, families with children, everyone fascinated by the motionless guard. Hayes pushed through them, positioned himself directly in front of Barrett. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced. His voice carried the authority of someone used to commanding troops. "You're witnessing an interesting contrast in military philosophies today." He gestured toward Barrett like a museum guide pointing at an exhibit. "This represents the British approach, ceremonial precision valued over combat readiness." Some tourists looked uncomfortable. Others pulled out their phones. "In my 22 years with the United States Marine Corps," Hayes continued, "I've led men through 3 combat deployments: Baghdad, Fallujah, Helmand Province." He turned toward Barrett. "In each instance, our success depended on adaptability, tactical awareness, immediate response to changing threats." An elderly man in a blazer stepped forward. British military medals adorned his chest, lots of them. "Young man, you're out of line," he said quietly. His voice was firm. "These guardsmen have served in the same combat zones you mention. Their ceremonial duty represents discipline, not deficiency." Hayes glanced at the medals, then dismissed them with a wave. "With respect, sir, I'm simply highlighting different approaches. A soldier who spends hours practicing standing still isn't developing tactical flexibility." The elderly veteran's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Other tourists began backing away slowly, sensing they were witnessing something that had crossed from curiosity into confrontation. A mother pulled her young daughter closer, whispering something about giving the men space. An Australian couple exchanged worried glances, their cameras lowering as the entertainment value of the moment transformed into genuine discomfort. The British veteran's medals caught the light as he shook his head slowly, recognizing the kind of arrogance he'd seen before in his own military career. It was the arrogance of someone who believed their experience was the only valid experience, their methods the only correct methods. He'd lost friends to that kind of thinking in wars long past, when commanders refused to listen to local knowledge or respect different tactical approaches. Hayes stepped even closer to Barrett, inches away now. "You know what impresses me about American forces?" he said. "When a Marine is addressed by a superior officer, they respond. They engage. They don't hide behind ceremonial protocols." A woman in the crowd gasped. Hayes leaned in, close enough that his next words were meant for Barrett alone, but they carried to everyone nearby. "Have you ever actually seen combat, Sergeant? Or did they put you here because you look good in red?" That's when Colonel Wilson appeared. "Lieutenant Colonel Hayes." His voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Rejoin the delegation, immediately." Hayes hesitated. For a moment, it looked like he might refuse. But Wilson's expression left no room for argument. Hayes stepped back. But he wasn't done. Not by a long shot. "British inflexibility hasn't changed since colonial times," he muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. "They cling to outdated protocols and call it tradition." As they walked away, other American officers created subtle distance from Hayes. His isolation was becoming obvious. But across the grounds, Barrett remained perfectly still. If the confrontation had affected him, there was no outward sign. His expression hadn't changed. His posture hadn't shifted. Perfect discipline, perfect control. And that, more than anything, seemed to infuriate Hayes even more. The scheduled changing of the guard ceremony gave Hayes his final opportunity. The crowds shifted position for better views. Cameras ready. Everyone excited to see the famous ceremony. In the confusion, Hayes slipped away. Major Davis didn't notice until it was too late. By the time he looked around, Hayes was already halfway across the grounds, heading straight for Barrett. "Your ceremonial changing of the guard is quite the performance," Hayes announced as he arrived. "Impressive choreography, I'll grant you that. But in the Marines, we change posts with efficiency, not pageantry." He positioned himself directly in Barrett's line of sight, blocking his view completely. Violation number 1. Posted signs around the palace grounds were clear. 3 simple rules. Do not touch the guards. Do not touch their equipment. Do not obstruct their line of sight. Hayes was about to break all 3. "Let me explain something about military protocol," he continued. His voice took on a lecturing tone. "Across NATO forces, there exists a universal understanding of chain of command." He tapped the insignia on his uniform. "Lieutenant Colonel, United States Marine Corps, combat decorations from 3 theaters, command experience in joint force operations." Then he jabbed a finger toward Barrett. "And you, a sergeant whose primary skill is standing still." Hayes began circling again, his pace measured, deliberate. "Your uniform is impressive, Sergeant, very historical." The way he said historical made it sound like an insult. Then he did it. His hand reached out. Fingers touched the sleeve of Barrett's scarlet tunic, rubbing the fabric between thumb and forefinger. "Wool," Hayes said. "In combat conditions, this would be a liability." Violation number 2. The crowd collectively tensed. Everyone knew the rule. Never touch the guards. "He just touched him," an American tourist whispered loudly. "You're not supposed to do that." But Hayes wasn't finished. His hand moved to Barrett's rifle. Fingers brushed against the barrel. Ceremonial weapon or actually functional? Violation number 3. An audible murmur ran through the crowd. Some people backed away. Others pulled out phones to record. Palace security personnel were moving closer now, but they maintained diplomatic discretion. This was a foreign military officer after all, not some random tourist. Hayes planted himself squarely in front of Barrett, directly blocking his 1,000-yard stare. The morning sun had climbed higher now, casting sharp shadows across the courtyard. The light caught the gold braid on Hayes's uniform, making him look even more official, even more authoritative. He seemed to grow larger in that moment, puffing out his chest slightly like a peacock displaying its feathers. Everything about his body language screamed dominance, hierarchy, superiority. He'd spent decades in a system where rank meant everything, where a single oak leaf or eagle on your collar determined who spoke and who listened. He genuinely believed that those symbols transcended borders, transcended national boundaries, transcended centuries of tradition. In his mind, this was a teaching moment. He was correcting a deficiency in British military protocol. He was demonstrating proper respect for chain of command. He was doing Barrett a favor. "The difference between our forces is responsiveness," Hayes said. "A Marine Guard acknowledges superior officers, maintains situational awareness, responds to changing conditions." He straightened to his full height, assumed a formal military bearing. The crowd fell silent. Something was about to happen. Everyone could feel it. Hayes took a breath, then spoke with the unmistakable command tone of a senior officer addressing troops. "Guard," he announced. "I am Lieutenant Colonel Jackson Hayes, United States Marine Corps, NATO Joint Command authorized." His voice carried across the grounds. Clear, authoritative, official. Military protocol across Allied forces requires junior personnel to render appropriate respect to senior officers. He paused. Let the words sink in. "This is a direct order from a lieutenant colonel in the United States Marine Corps." Another pause, then the demand that changed everything. "Salute me. Now." The words hung in the air like a gunshot. For one long moment, nobody moved. The crowd held its breath. Hayes stood there, confident, certain he'd just asserted proper military authority. and Sergeant William Barrett remained perfectly still, eyes forward, expression blank, the 1,000-yard stare unbroken. 1 second passed, 2 seconds, 3. Then something shifted. Barrett's hand moved with surgical precision. White gloved fingers smoothly removed Hayes's hand from the rifle, firm but controlled. No aggression. No, just efficiency. "Sir," Barrett spoke. His voice was crisp, clear, the perfect articulation of British military precision. Hayes's eyes widened slightly. He clearly hadn't expected any response at all. "You are in violation of standing orders regarding interaction with the Queen's Guard," Barrett continued. "Physical contact with a guard or his equipment constitutes a Category B security infraction." The crowd leaned in. Everyone wanted to hear this. "Furthermore," Barrett said, his gaze now directly meeting Hayes's, "while your rank commands appropriate respect within NATO allied forces, Standing Palace Protocol establishes clear guidelines regarding chain of command." His delivery was respectful, but unyielding. "The Queen's Guard operates under the direct authority of the Crown, not NATO command structure." Hayes opened his mouth to interrupt, but Barrett wasn't finished. "Standing Order 157 specifically addresses interaction with Allied military personnel. Guards will maintain position and bearing regardless of visiting military rank, as their oath is sworn first to the sovereign." Each word was precisely delivered. No emotion, just facts. "My duty is to the Crown first, Lieutenant Colonel. That duty includes maintaining prescribed position, bearing, and protocol regardless of external military authority." Barrett's posture never changed. His voice never rose. But every word landed with the force of a hammer. "This isn't a matter of disrespect to your rank, sir, but rather absolute respect for the oath of service I have sworn." His white-gloved hand returned to his rifle in one fluid motion. The movement was so smooth it looked choreographed. He resumed his ceremonial position. Perfect stillness restored. "I must respectfully request you step back to the designated viewing area and refrain from further physical contact with palace guards or equipment." Silence. Complete and total silence. Hayes stood there frozen, his face flushed red, his jaw clenched tight. He'd just been corrected, professionally, publicly, by a sergeant. The crowd's reaction rippled through like a wave. Some people smiled, others nodded in approval. A few even started to clap before catching themselves. Then a voice cut through the tension. "Lieutenant Colonel Hayes." Captain Richard Wells approached with measured strides. His uniform marked him as Guard Commander. "I believe there might be some misunderstanding regarding protocol on palace grounds," Wells said. His tone was diplomatic but firm. "Captain Wells, Guard Commander." Hayes turned, his posture rigid. "Your guard broke position to address me," Hayes stated. His tone suggested this proved his earlier point about ceremonial rigidity. "Indeed, sir," Captain Wells replied evenly. Sergeant Barrett followed Standing Order 157, Paragraph 3. "In the event of physical contact or immediate security concerns, guards are authorized to respond with minimum necessary communication and action." He delivered it like reciting from a manual. No judgment, just facts. His response was textbook for the situation. Hayes's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "In 30 years of military service across 4 continents, I've never encountered a junior officer who refused a direct order from a superior." "That's because Sergeant Barrett wasn't refusing an order, Lieutenant Colonel," Wells clarified. "He was following his primary standing orders, which specify that on palace grounds, his chain of command flows through the Crown, not visiting military personnel, regardless of rank." The words were gentle, but the message was clear. "You don't have authority here." The distinction was subtle but crucial, the kind of nuance that gets lost in broad assumptions about military hierarchy. Every soldier in every army swears an oath, but those oaths aren't identical. American soldiers swear to defend the Constitution. British soldiers swear allegiance to the monarch. The difference isn't just semantic, it's foundational. It determines who gives orders and under what circumstances those orders must be followed. Hayes had built his entire career on a clear understanding of American military law and protocol, but he'd made the fatal error of assuming that understanding transferred perfectly to every other military force. It didn't. The British military system had evolved over centuries with its own logic, its own requirements, its own internal consistency. Dismissing that as outdated or inefficient was like an architect from one country declaring another country's building codes invalid simply because they were different. Several yards away, the elderly British veteran was explaining to the American tourists nearby. "The Royal Guards aren't just ceremonial figures," he told them quietly. "They're active combat soldiers, many with multiple deployments. Barrett there served with distinction in Afghanistan, alongside American forces." Colonel Wilson had finally located Hayes. He approached with barely concealed frustration. "Lieutenant Colonel, the delegation is awaiting your return." His tone made it clear this wasn't a request. Captain Wells turned to address both American officers. "Perhaps I might offer some context. The guards you see today completed a 6-month combat deployment just 8 weeks ago. Sergeant Barrett himself was awarded a commendation for actions under fire during a joint operation with American Special Forces." Hayes's expression remained skeptical. "Different training philosophies," he muttered. "As do we," Wells replied smoothly. "But we consider the discipline of ceremonial duty to be complementary to combat readiness, not contradictory." He paused, letting that sink in. "The ability to maintain absolute focus and position under public scrutiny translates effectively to maintaining discipline under fire." Colonel Wilson nodded thoughtfully. "An interesting perspective, Captain. I've observed similar benefits from drill precision in our own forces." Hayes shifted impatiently. "With respect, sir, there's a substantial difference between drill discipline and standing motionless for tourists." "Is there?" Wells questioned mildly. "Both require absolute control, perfect execution under observation, and subordination of personal comfort to duty requirements." Before Hayes could respond, Wilson ended it. "We need to rejoin our delegation, Lieutenant Colonel. Now." It wasn't a suggestion. As Wilson escorted Hayes back toward the group, the lieutenant colonel muttered under his breath, "Ridiculous theatrical nonsense. Standing around in bright red targets pretending it's military discipline." "Lieutenant Colonel Hayes," Wilson said quietly. His voice carried the authority of a commanding officer who rarely needed to raise it. "You've created a diplomatic incident on what was supposed to be a routine goodwill visit." The other American officers had noticed the commotion. As Hayes rejoined them, several glanced his way before diplomatically looking elsewhere. "British inflexibility hasn't changed since colonial times," Hayes remarked to Major Davis, loud enough for nearby officers to hear. "They cling to outdated protocols and call it tradition." But the other officers created subtle distance. Hayes's isolation was becoming impossible to ignore. The delegation completed their tour in uncomfortable silence. As they walked toward the gates where their motorcade waited, they passed near Barrett's post one final time. Several officers, including Colonel Wilson, offered respectful nods toward the guard. Subtle acknowledgments of professional courtesy. Hayes wasn't among them. "They're soldiers, not statues," he said as they approached the vehicles. His voice carried a defensive edge. "Military effectiveness is measured by adaptability, not theatrical performance." An American general who had remained silent throughout spoke up. "Interesting perspective, Lieutenant Colonel. Though I noted that Sergeant Barrett adapted quite effectively to your challenge. His response was both appropriate and professionally delivered." Hayes's expression tightened. "A rehearsed response to a predictable situation isn't adaptability, sir. It's script following." "Perhaps," the general mused. "But it resolved the situation decisively while maintaining protocol. Tactical objective achieved with minimum necessary force. Sounds rather effective to me." No one else spoke. The general's words hung in the air with quiet authority, the kind that comes from decades of actual command rather than just time in service. He was a man who'd led coalitions, who'd worked with military forces from dozens of countries, who understood that effectiveness came in many forms. He'd seen American Marines operate with breathtaking speed and firepower. He'd seen British paratroopers execute missions with methodical precision. He'd seen French Foreign Legion troops display savage courage. He'd seen Israeli commandos demonstrate tactical brilliance. None of them did things exactly the same way, and yet all of them were effective. The mark of a truly experienced military leader wasn't judging different approaches against your own standard. It was recognizing excellence wherever it appeared, even when it looked different from what you expected. As the motorcade pulled away from the gates, Hayes stared stonily through the window. In the distance, Barrett's scarlet uniform remained visible, a vivid splash of color against the stone walls. The guard's unwavering discipline was the final image as the vehicles departed. Hayes never looked back. So what really happened here? On the surface, it looks like a simple misunderstanding. An American officer who didn't know the local protocols. But it goes deeper than that. This story reveals something fundamental about military culture, about respect, about the difference between authority and jurisdiction. Hayes assumed his rank gave him universal authority, that a lieutenant colonel from any NATO country could give orders to any junior soldier from another country. He was wrong. Military rank does matter, but it exists within a framework, a structure, a chain of command, and that chain of command has boundaries. On palace grounds, the Royal Guard answers to the Crown, not to visiting officers, not to NATO command, not to anyone else. Their oath is sworn to the sovereign first. That's not a ceremonial detail. It's a fundamental principle of military organization. Hayes saw the bright uniforms and assumed these were toy soldiers, decorations for tourists. The truth is the opposite. Royal Guards are elite infantry. They complete 30 weeks of intensive training, 2 weeks longer than regular British infantry. They learn everything a combat soldier needs: urban warfare, tactical movement, advanced weapons, close quarters battle. But they also learn something most soldiers never master: perfect mental discipline, the ability to stand absolutely still while people mock you, while they wave hands in your face, while they test your resolve. That mental control? It's the same control that keeps you alive in combat. When bullets start flying, when everything goes wrong, when chaos erupts, the soldier who can maintain focus survives. These guards rotate constantly. 3 months ceremonial, 6 months deployed, then back again. The same man standing perfectly still at the palace gate today might be kicking down doors in a combat zone next month. Many of the current Royal Guards returned from Afghanistan just weeks before this incident. They've seen combat, real combat, the kind Hayes claims to value so highly. Sergeant Barrett's Military Cross wasn't awarded for standing still. It was earned under fire, in a joint operation with American Special Forces, the same American forces Hayes represents. The irony is thick. But there's another lesson here, one about cultural respect and international military cooperation. NATO exists because allied nations work together. But working together doesn't mean everyone does things the same way. Different military cultures have different traditions, different protocols, different approaches. The British value ceremonial precision because they see it as complementary to combat readiness. Americans value tactical flexibility and efficiency. Neither approach is wrong. They're just different. And different doesn't mean inferior. Hayes's mistake wasn't just about protocol. It was about assuming his way was the only valid way. That kind of thinking undermines the entire concept of international military cooperation. When that American general said tactical objective achieved with minimum necessary force, he was making a point. Barrett's response was actually a perfect example of effective military action. He identified a violation. He responded with minimum necessary communication. He reasserted proper protocol. He resolved the situation without escalation. Mission accomplished. That's not ceremony. That's professional military competence. The entire incident revealed a broader truth about modern warfare and military alliances. In an era where coalition operations are the norm rather than the exception, the ability to work across different military cultures isn't just nice to have. It's essential. American forces regularly deploy alongside British, French, German, Canadian, and dozens of other allied militaries. Each brings their own traditions, their own command structures, their own approaches to training and discipline. An officer who can't recognize and respect those differences isn't just culturally insensitive. They're operationally ineffective. The best military leaders understand that diversity in approach actually strengthens alliances because it brings different perspectives, different skill sets, different ways of solving problems to the table. Hayes failed that test completely. So where does this leave us? The motorcade drove away that day. Hayes still believed he was right, still convinced that ceremonial traditions were a waste of military resources. But everyone else saw something different. They saw a sergeant who maintained perfect discipline under pressure, who knew his protocols, who responded with precision and professionalism. They saw a guard who understood something Hayes didn't. That true strength isn't about dominating others. It's about mastering yourself. Barrett stood at his post for hours that day, through mockery, through provocation, through physical violation of his space and equipment, and when the moment required action, he responded with perfect control. No anger, no ego, just professional competence. That's what real military discipline looks like. The Royal Guards represent over 360 years of military tradition, but they're not living in the past. They deploy to modern combat zones. They use modern weapons and tactics. They train alongside special forces from multiple nations. They're elite soldiers who happen to wear red tunics. Never judge a soldier by their uniform alone. The bearskin hat doesn't make Barrett less of a warrior. It represents a tradition of service that predates most modern militaries. And that tradition continues because it works. Because mental discipline matters. Because precision under observation translates to precision under fire. Because sometimes standing perfectly still takes more strength than moving. If this story changed how you think about ceremonial military duties, smash that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel for more untold military stories that reveal the truth behind the traditions. Drop a comment below. What's your take? Are ceremonial duties a valuable part of military training, or a waste of resources? Share this video with someone who needs to understand that different military traditions all deserve respect. We've got another incredible story coming tomorrow about duty, honor, and unexpected courage in the face of impossible odds. You won't want to miss it. Remember, true military professionalism isn't about asserting dominance. It's about understanding your role, respecting the chain of command, and executing your mission with precision. Whether you're wearing dress blues or a scarlet tunic, whether you're storming a compound or standing guard at a gate, service is service, and every uniform tells a story worth respecting. The guards will still be standing at their posts tomorrow morning when the sun rises over the palace grounds. They'll stand there the day after that, and the day after that, maintaining a tradition that has survived world wars, revolutions, and countless changes in military doctrine. Tourists will still take photos, children will still giggle and point, and somewhere in the world another soldier who once wore that scarlet tunic will be executing a mission in a combat zone. The two roles aren't separate. They're two sides of the same coin. And understanding that distinction is what separates those who truly understand military service from those who only think they do.